Well, again, good evening, everybody. It's so great to have you all here. We will get started with our presentation for our intro to ARC this evening. I also want to welcome all of those who are viewing live on our live stream at this moment. To thank you so much for viewing for tonight. My name is Martha Martinez. I'm the NAGPRA coordinator for the Tribal Historic Preservation Office. NAGPRA stands for the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. So I work with our TIPO office in that capacity here in the community. So we do our best to try to hold this quarterly as best that we can. So sometimes we get it every three months. If not, we do our best to. But I do want to go ahead and turn the time over for our presenter for this evening, and have a little bit bio here. Mr. Edward A. Jolie is an anthropologist with broad interest in the indigenous archaeology and ethnology of the Americas. His research focused on the study of perishables or organic material cultures like string, footwears, baskets, and textiles. Beyond perishable technologies, Dr. Jolie has long held an interest in Native American anthropologist relations, repatriation matters, and a broad ethical practice within anthropology. Being a mix of Oglala Lakota and Muskogee Creek ancestry and an enrolled citizen of the Muskogee Nation of Oklahoma. He strives to cultivate collaborative relationships and research partnerships with Native Americans and other descendant communities. So let's turn the time over to Mr. Jolie. I don't want to mess it up.
Thank you. All right, great, thank you. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay, I have a tendency to be loud anyway, so let me know if I step too far away. And I also gathered that, I see a camera pointing at me. Am I on camera too? Oh, I thought I'd get, for everybody at home, I thought I'd get to be this disembodied voice, but I guess you're looking at my face. Well, apologies. Well, thank you all first and foremost for having me. Thank you to Dr. Sunday Iselt for inviting me and you all to host me here. As you're going to find out, I'm pretty excited, pretty thrilled to be able to talk more about Devil's Claw and share my enthusiasm, because I know there's some existing enthusiasm already here in the audience. The title of my presentation is Ihug, Devil's Claw, Potential and Possibilities for the Future from the Past. And what I want to do in the time I have is really, it's not so much a presentation, so much of research as it is sort of a summary and in some ways a pitch. This is a plant that I learned about in graduate school, and since moving to Tucson for the position that I now have at the University of Arizona, I've had the opportunity to engage and be a little more hands-on with the plant. And as I've done that, I just continue to be amazed by what an incredible plant is and how little we know about its deep history, aspects of its unwritten history. And literally just in the few hours before this talk today, I've learned new little tidbits of information about how people have used Ihug and autumn Ihug in the past and continue to use it today. And so the big thrust, if I want to plant that seed right now, is to get people thinking about how we might continue to connect to talk about Devil's Claw and how we might sort of continue to share information, learn about the plant, but also entertain some possibilities for future applications, whether it be as a food, elevating and amplifying its importance as a traditional food source for autumn peoples and other tribes in southern Arizona, but also as a plant that for anybody who's a little bit more entrepreneurial, there might be opportunities to leverage what we can learn about this incredible plant in ways that might provide economic opportunities for tribal nations in southern Arizona. So with that, that's sort of the aim. Let's see. I think let's try this. Perfect. So a little bit of context to give you a sense of how I ended up working with Devil's Claw and baskets in general, because it really, not only is being a Native person in archaeology anomalous, but studying baskets and textiles is doubly anomalous because they don't preserve really well. They are crafts that are typically the domain of women. That is, they represent women's work and women's labor. And that isn't something that, owing to poor preservation archaeology, was of great interest to archaeologists historically early on in the days of the field. So it remains the case that even though we don't get a lot of well-preserved baskets and textiles from archaeological sites, there are still very few of us, I'd say really a handful in the United States alone, that spend any real serious time engaging in the study of these types of technologies, whether they're ancient or more recent. But my introduction, really has to do with this family piece that you see here. This is Unchi's. Unchi is a Lakota word for grandmother. Really, she would be my great-great-grandmother. This was her gambling basket. And most people don't think of native peoples of the plains as basket makers, but there were some types of baskets that were made among a variety of forms and functions for a number of different groups. But one of the more common types of basketry on the plains is what you see here. This coiled bowl, really just about this big, not terribly large, but it was used predominantly in a women's gambling game, a dice game, a game of chance in which the dice made out of peach pits and plum pits and bison ribs were taken and they were thrown in the basket. The basket was shaken, the women would slam the basket down, the dice would pop up, and they'd make wagers based on what their expectation of the outcome was. And in this particular case, I would come to find out in my research that some people remarked that the women that were the biggest gamblers had their own basket. So I don't know what that says about Unchi, but this was her basket. We hope that she was a good gambler or had some good luck. But this is really a far more widespread game that a lot of women on the Northern Plains would play when the men were ostensibly out hunting bison, waiting for them to return. When I was in college, I was exposed through one of my undergraduate professors to the study of these things as objects of material culture, as textiles and baskets and sandals. And that was not something that really ever entertained a thought in my mind. I was interested in archaeology and learning about the past, but thinking about organic materials wasn't really anywhere on the picture because people didn't talk about it. They don't preserve. So what really is there to talk about? But when I brought this in and began to do research on it and say, I looked in the literature, there isn't much written about these baskets. I can't find but a few scant references. I call up anthropologists and I say, what can you tell me about this basket that I have? And they say, well, one, Indians didn't have gambling. And I said, okay, sure. I mean, casinos is what you think of now, but no, gambling, games of chance have been around for a long time. But it was just this general lack of knowledge, and that really that it wasn't that I wasn't finding anything. Some would say, maybe you're not finding anything because there's nothing to find. And I thought, well, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So it sort of, I became incensed, and then, of course, was driven further to keep calling people and writing people and asking questions. And at the end, this became the focus of my sort of senior project in college that I ended up actually turning into an article and getting published in a journal. But it was a turning point for me because not only did it solidify my interest in baskets and real fascination with this as a craft and material culture that can tell us about people, but it also really clarified for me that anthropology can be useful to Native people, that it isn't purely about extraction, that while anthropology and archaeology are particularly deserving of the bad rap that they get, I'm not a person that's ready to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I really think that we need to think slowly about ways that we can rehabilitate anthropology. And this was an opportunity for me to realize that we can use tools and data from anthropology to help revitalize and rejuvenate information that might be dormant or might even be lost in a lot of our societies. So that's the approach and perspective that I bring to this. The other element of this is that it's equally important to me that what we do be useful. And that is a challenge because a lot of archaeology, there's a generation of knowledge and data for the sake of having that knowledge and information. And that's fine and all, that's all fine and well. We need information. And sometimes we appreciate that the application use that might come further down the line, that we don't see what its use is now, but we anticipate it will be useful. But I am very much interested in leveraging what we learn about these technologies to make them useful for people in the here and now. And I know that it's a problem for a lot of communities here in Arizona, but the accessibility and availability of materials for traditional craft activities, in particular basketry and other activities, is a challenge not just here in Arizona, but in the Pacific Northwest and where I formerly used to teach and collect basketry materials in the Great Lakes region. Penny Minner is a friend. She's an exceptional master Seneca black ash basket weaver. She makes cornhouse dolls, and as to make it any greater, her being a triple threat. She's an amazing bead worker. But one of the things over the last 10 years that, as I came to know Penny and talk with her about basketry was the emerald ash borer was becoming more devastating for plants, in particular the ash trees in Pennsylvania and throughout the Great Lakes. And the emerald ash borer is a invasive insect species from Asia that gets in under the bark of the ash tree, and it can survive the incredibly cold, harsh winters and all the snow. And when it emerges, it eats its way around the tree under the bark, effectively girdling it and killing it. So you get new growth, young growth that emerges, but within the span of a few years before it really reaches maturity, at which it's ideal for harvesting for ash plant basketry, the trees are dying. And so what this has meant is that we go from having, Martha showed me how to do the laser, let's say. So we went from having ample splints to generate large baskets to, by the time I moved to Tucson in 2021, she was having to go to weavers that could get ash in Nova Scotia and at far northern Canada because she couldn't get it anywhere locally. So literally it's gotten to the point where she can hardly weave baskets anymore because of that lack of availability. But I also appreciated that Penny, being a pretty impressive artist, during the pandemic turned to making corn husk dolls for lack of corn husk out of recycling Amazon packaging materials. So I knew Penny would be open to some conversations about ways that we might explore alternative, I'm technologically not well inclined, clearly. Thinking about alternative ways to engage with these issues. And so one of the things that I drew on in my experiences working with museum collections out west and then being back east was I have an awareness appreciation for all the different types of plants that people use. Things like bracken fern, the roots and the stems are hugely important in basketry in the Pacific Northwest down into Northern California. I've learned that there's actually an eastern variety of bracken fern that works out really well for basketry. Cedar, roots, and bark is hugely important from parts of the Midwest and Great Lakes all the way across in the Pacific Northwest coast of North America for a wide variety of baskets and bags and textiles. I collected and harvested eastern hemlock root, and it is a beautiful material for basketry. So we have been and continue to have conversations about how we might draw on other materials, because the big thing for me was what I don't want is this person here to stop weaving. And that's what it was getting to the point that we were concerned about, is that she's not going to be able to be weaving. And I recognize that there are sometimes restraints and concerns about using non-traditional materials, but I like to remind people too that one of the big lessons that I've taken away from archaeology is that those historical documents, those archaeological records, those anthropological records don't record everything. We learn things all the time from archaeology that isn't written down anywhere, that has been dormant and might tell us something about how people use plants or different plants in the past. So we have for the past few years, and here we are with my wife, anthropologist, Dr. Ruth Jolie, our collaborator, Dr. Gwendolyn Saul, and Elizabeth, the curator at the, let's see, I'm going to get this eventually, at the Rochester Museum of Nature and Science, looking at 18th century kilt that was collected from Seneca territory. And so we have been and continue to be sort of having conversations about what other alternative materials are available. But also Penny has expressed an interest in learning new techniques. Techniques like twining were very common and widespread in the Northeast, but were largely replaced and supplanted by European-made manufacturers, and the economic windfall that this production of ash plant basketry provided. People could make ash plant baskets, sell them, and make money. Making twined carrying straps or bags didn't really survive much into the 1800s. But Penny, we hope, is renewing that interest and working in that way. So what this does is get me again thinking about, now that I'm back out west, having spent time in graduate school in Reno and in Albuquerque. I love and have missed the Desert West, so I'm really grateful and privileged to be back here. But thinking about, again, revisiting some of the materials that we have that sit around in museums that aren't necessarily being used, or thinking about, as I like to, Can I think about new ways to get information or make these collections useful to people in the here and now? And one of the things that was impressed upon me long ago by one of my graduate advisors, Kay Fowler, was the important relationship between people and plants on landscapes. And I think it's a common adage or saying that people care for plants and plants care for people. And this is the way it has been since time immemorial. And we often overlook it when we focus too much on the finished product, on the object. We can lose sight of the fact that these baskets and the plants from which they're made represent the culmination of these long-term human environment, human-plant relationships. These are, in a more scientific sense, we can think of them as co-evolutionary relationships. People have evolved alongside plants, just as plants have evolved alongside people. And people often have neglected, up until recently, the extent to which humans have modified and altered plants and landscapes. The thing that we hear a lot about now is fire, and how fire could be used to shape and mold landscapes and environments. And that low-level fires, if conducted in a controlled way, aren't a bad thing. In fact, they reduce the fuel load and mitigate large, massive fires, wildfires on the landscape. But there's also been sort of an associated increase of attention given to what some anthropologists have called light hand management. So these types of practices that reflect people engaging with and managing and working with plants, but not what we think of when we think of agriculture. When we're dealing with agriculture and domesticated plants, we're talking about plants that are generally, largely, if not fully, solely reliant on people. But a lot of basketry plants like sumac benefit from tending and managing. They benefit from a little extra water. Who doesn't? They benefit from tending and weeding. And as you'll know, they respond really well to coppicing and pruning. When you cut them back, like we do with fruit trees and a lot of other plants, it promotes new growth. But this is really manifest in stark ways when you think about branching architecture. Some of those plants that are really ideal for basketry production are those that are long straight shoots. They're blemish-free. They don't have branch scars. They don't have insect or fungus damage. And they reflect plants that are modified by these types of relationships, but relationships that don't preserve in the archaeological record like the plants themselves. These are things that if they are allowed to rewild, are not subjected to this care by people, then they'll return to this sort of standard branching architecture, which is not really well suited for weaving. But you can promote the growth of really amazing fiber plants. Now, one of the things that really struck me coming back to Arizona or coming back out west and living here now in southern Arizona was taking in more of the overall landscape and environment. And again, doing it through this lens of I have access to these incredible collections as an archaeologist at the Arizona State Museum and the University of Arizona, ancient baskets and sandals and the like. But also it's foregrounding this relationship between the objects and the plants and what they might be able to tell us, or what are we missing about those relationships. And one of the things that really stimulated this in my mind was thinking about the increasing loss of the threatened iconic riparian landscape that represented by the mesquite bosque. Because again, one of these things is that you can go visit a few of these landscapes, like here at Tumacacori, south of Tucson. And one of the things I was struck by is, again, having this knowledge of how Timbisha Shoshone and other groups in southern Nevada and adjacent parts of California have been documented as really tending and managing and looking after the landscape. Not just basketry plants, but they would look after and clear out the loose fuel wood from underneath the mesquite trees. They were coppicing and pruning them. They were in essence sort of cleaning up, like tidying up. And it not only had the benefit of removing fuel that would become a fire hazard, but this was wood that people would use for fuel. It was wood for material culture. And of course, it could help promote the growth and abundance of the mesquite beans that are important staple food source. But also, by clearing this up, you are modifying and adjusting the habitat for the wildlife that comes through. And I thought, gosh, this is such a threatened, negatively impacted landscape that we don't even, I've done a little bit of reading on this, we don't even really have a big handle or understanding of how things might have looked before it was decimated by modern landscape modification and drought. We really don't have a handle, except some studies have shown that some of the greatest avian, bird biodiversity can be found even today in some of Arizona's mesquite bosque. So again, all this sort of builds this picture of what is it that we're missing. And again, being someone who's really interested and fascinated by basketry, not just the technology, but the materials and what they tell us about relationships to the land, I always find myself coming back to a couple of the baskets that you see here. These are baskets that are chain-wavy at the Arizona State Museum. And they've always stuck out to me and been a couple of my favorites for several reasons. Not just because they're gorgeous, but also they're exceptionally well executed, very finely stitched. I've looked at a lot of old and recent baskets. I have a real appreciation for that technical skill, because it's not just about knowing how to sew the stitches, it's knowing how to prepare the materials, or having sufficiently tended to the plants so that you get the materials that you want so that you can then process them to perfection. And these I appreciate because what you'll see is the black lining the outline of this basket, or the rim of this basket, as well as the bulk of the decorative material here. And the red is perhaps willow that's been dyed with white rhatany. The roots of which are actually documented here among autumn weaving traditions as a dye, a red dye source for dyeing willow and other plants. Now, in this particular case, it's sort of the aesthetics and skill and execution, but also having spent a lot of time looking at Southwestern basketry, I've often been struck as well by how much some of the designs, the motifs and elements strongly remind me of 2,000-year-old baskets. These are two separate baskets, not the same basket, but ancient baskets from the so-called basket maker culture of the Four Corners region of the northern Southwest. And it shouldn't be surprising. There are these ancient, long, deep connections that go stretch into the past that we don't really fully understand or are able to sort of calibrate in a calendrical sense. But we also know that things like designs, motifs, and elements on pots and baskets are some of the most widely distributed and easily shared things, because, well, you can see them from afar, right? You don't necessarily have to have the details of how they are made. You can capture that mental image and take it home and reproduce this. But every time I see this, I'm not only struck again by the skill and execution, but how it reminds me of some of these deep, long-term ancient connections between Puebloan and other groups on the Colorado Plateau, as far west as chain-wavy groups, and of course, everybody in between. And in thinking about that, I was reminded not long ago of an a mid-19th century account talking about how chain-wavy weavers, and this was documented in documents dating back to the 1850s, that chain-wavy weavers had acquired the white-seeded seeds of domesticated devil's claw through Quechan groups to their north that had in turn previously acquired them from autumn peoples in Arizona. So really an early example of down the line sort of exchange and sharing and dissemination of seeds of the white-seeded variety of devil's claw, making it to, chain-wavy territory in Southern California on the border with Arizona, in the 1850s. And I thought, well, this has to have been going on for a long time. What does that have to do with devil's claw? Well, back in the 80s, there was a fair bit of research looking at devil's claw that came to appreciate and acknowledge, in the academic literature, because people here know, but in the academic literature, play out the fact that, this is a pretty transformation to go from the black-seeded variety with small, short claws to the semi-domesticated white-seeded variety. And it's a pretty dramatic transformation. There are 10 different species of devil's claw in the Americas. In fact, the genetics suggest that devil's claw, the family of which it is a part, is originally from South America. There are related plants in South America. But there are three main species here. And what you see represented here is one of the more common and also one of the more important ones, Proboscidea parviflora. And it is a variant of this, Parviflora ho'okamiyana, which is the semi-domesticated variety. So I'm going to refer to it as a domesticate, or the white-seeded variety. In a technical sense, you might think of it as semi-domesticated, because a true domesticate is one that is completely reliant on people to reproduce. So devil's claw, the white-seed variety, is fairly well on the way. Now, not surprisingly, we have good documentation that more than 30 native nations have used devil's claw, often as a fiber source in basketry, but also as well as a food source and also a medicine. In fact, the primary sort of center of gravity for the use of devil's claw as a fiber source in basketry is not surprisingly right here where we are. But we have both ethnographic museum specimens that are relatively recent, and I've in the last 6-9 months come across archaeological examples of devil's claw that were used in baskets that go back perhaps 1,000 or 2,000 years from as far east as the El Paso area. And of course, we've got good evidence of Chemehuevi, Katanamook, Panamint Shoshone, and other groups using it in more recent times. But what's really striking about it is sort of the transformation that devil's claw has undergone. It's a pretty amazing plant in and of itself. And I have a fanciful array here, if you can see them up front. I've tacked them on to the front of the podium. This is an example that I collected roadside from Tuacacari in less than last year or so. And you get a sense of the small length of the claws. So this is Proboscidea parviflora, but this is the wild variety with black seeds, okay? And then what you have right here, this is a white-seeded, semi-domesticated variety that I grew in my front yard in Tucson with considerable thanks and acknowledgement to August Wood, who provided me the seeds that made this possible. This has allowed me to get a lot more sort of opportunity to observe the growth of the plant. It's a pretty dramatic transformation. And to summarize the evidence, by and large, there's no reason to suggest that the plant had been brought under cultivation anywhere else but here in southern Arizona by autumn peoples and their neighbors. And the emphasis really appears to be on lengthening, enhancing the length of the claw as it would be used for fiber. So for those of you that aren't as familiar with weaving, making baskets, you're getting more bang for your buck. A longer claw means you get more stitching thread. That means you're spending less time processing to get little short lengths that you then have to constantly splice or add in. And it makes a big difference in terms of the amount of time and energy you spend. But also, having those longer claws, you can just keep stitching and sewing and sewing and sewing. There is some evidence to suggest that the white-seeded, the domesticated variety, has a higher protein and oil content. But this is something that I'd like to, and I hope others will be interested in following up on, because if so, that would be a really sort of fascinating thing to look into. What sort of clinched this for me, that this might be an opportunity to really explore and invest in, was the first year that we were here. My daughter and I, she's grown about 6 inches since this photo. We took a weaving class with Regina and Megan Siqueiros at Mission Gardens. And that was spectacular, and my first opportunity to work hands-on with devil's claw. And one of the things I really appreciate about Regina is not only is she an amazing weaver and teacher, but she also said, these are autumn baskets. This is autumn style baskets, but anybody should be able to make it. Don't forget where the knowledge comes from. Don't fail to give credit, but learn. I'll show you how to make this. And so I completely appreciated how open and generous she was, and we had a blast. It was great fun. So fast forward a few years, and with the benefit of having access and growing some in my front yard, that gave me the opportunity to really watch the plant grow. I was floored by how beautiful the flowers are in person, and it's just a wild-looking plant. I've always been sort of captivated by just how bizarre it looks. I mean, it's on the plant. You see growing here, it looks kind of like a Hungarian hot pepper or something. But it's really just kind of wild. And then to see it dry out and split, that's what happens. This will dry out and it splits, and you get the claws and the seeds spill out. It stimulated me and interested in thinking, gosh, a lot of emphasis has been on saying, from the ethnobotanical data, from museum specimens, it looks like they think, and this has been the standard narrative for the past 30 or 40 years, that devil's claw was domesticated by autumn peoples and their neighbors, probably in the last 300 years, and more or less, and I'm simplifying, in response to encroachment by non-native Euro-American settlers. That led to a reduction in people's mobility, their ability to go out and harvest and collect. So that meant that people were growing and cultivating more devil's claw adjacent to their gardens and in their fields. That makes sense. There's lots of evidence that people did that, but that seems like a great deal of dramatic change in the plant to go from this to this in 300 years. Now, plants, the way they reproduce, it can get really, really complicated. They don't reproduce, or they can reproduce in more ways than people and animals can. And so I've been curious about what the time depth might be. And so again, being an archaeologist and having the privilege of working with these collections, I set out to go through drawer by drawer all the organic materials in the collections of the Arizona State Museum. And what I found, in fact, were some seed pods, but also fragments of baskets that I'm, in some cases, I'm certain, based on the visual characteristics, are devil's claw. We don't have good dates, but some here, like this fragment from the Point of Pines region on San Carlos Apache lands, is devil's claw and could date back probably somewhere between 80, 900 and 80, 1400. So considerably older. This basket from Ventana Cave could be 6 or 100 more years old. But the point is that it's out there. It's just no one has really looked for it. It's hard to recognize in some of these damaged archaeological specimens, but it got me thinking, well, maybe there's more. So I went back through some of my files, and I recall that I had the opportunity in the Smithsonian, when I was looking at other collections from the Southwest, to examine a coil basket from Casa Grande. And I have a photograph of the basket here that's at the Smithsonian. And what I've done is use a program that enhances it digitally. And I did it because, not that there were any doubts, but I love such sort of unambiguous, clear connections between the past and the present. And so you can hopefully make out the stepped design that's been digitally enhanced, because it's awfully faded than the original. And this is, I think, is very likely devil's claw. And then compare it with this early 20th century design. I mean, they're pretty identical designs. You see this, you see it's like, how can you ever deny these dramatic connections to the past, not just in technique, but in materials. So as I was thinking more about these connections, it also got me thinking more about what else can we do with devil's claw, and how else can I be thinking about ways that we can learn from devil's claw, but also what more can we learn from collections that we already have? What new questions can we ask of the baskets in the Arizona State Museum and a lot of other places? And I will get there. But as I did this deep dive, I was not only thinking about the objects and baskets and drawing connections and making inferences about the chronology and timing of devil's claw domestication and the when and where, but I know it's an important plant for people here and in many communities in Arizona as a fiber source for basketry. But I know that questions of or issues of accessibility sometimes rear their heads. It's not always easy to get these plants. I remember Regina telling me that she had been harassed by police before in Tucson and elsewhere for collecting roadside plants. And there's no law against collecting roadside plants for basketry, particularly if they're non-threatened species. So these things continue to swirl around in my mind. And so what I'm going to do from here on out is talk about what I've learned and really kind of just share with you some of the ideas that I've had about possibilities for future research, and offering a way to sort of continue the conversation and share information. Because as I've told a couple of you already in talking about this is not my plant. I've become a super fan of devil's claw, but I want to use my position and resources to help sort of facilitate conversations about it. Let's compile our resources. I have thoughts and ideas, and I'm one person, but if we get some of that inertia and momentum behind us, then there's lots of cool stuff that we can do if people are interested. But again, this is just some ideas. So what else was I learning? Well, I read that people eat the plant. Yes, the seeds are tasty. Probably a lot of people have even tried the seeds. I think they taste a little bit like peanuts, and they're tasty. A fair bit of labor to get at. But I also learned that you can eat the seed pods, and the plant is incredibly productive. I planted them quite early in the season, probably even too early, I'm learning. And they continue to produce well into late October in Tucson. So I end up with a lot of really young pods at the end that I'm like, these aren't going to make it. So I ate them, and they were delicious. And in fact, what you see here is a a couple images of devil's claw seed pods, young ones that are not too tough, that I put on pizza that I made in my pizza oven. Delicious. I put them on a salad, and I wasn't thinking about taking pictures for presentations when I did this, which is why I would have made sure it looked actually like a salad rather than just a bowl of chicken. I assure you there's a large bed of kale that chicken is sitting on. But what I was struck by was how tasty it is. I pretty much eat everything. I like everything, but I also grew up in Southern Maryland. We ate a lot of okra, and okra is an acquired taste for some people. It's got that sort of mucilaginous, slimy texture that is really off-putting to some people. I think there's a similarity of texture and maybe flavor, not as much with the devil's claw seed pods, but completely lacking that slimy texture. So I always say people liken it to okra, and I'm like, okay, but that's off-putting to a lot of people. I actually think it's tastier in many ways than okra, and it has a lot of applications. So I'm fully a fan of getting people to think about growing it not just as a desert drought-tolerant plant that does really well in the environment here, but one that is tasty. It's a traditional food, and might be worth thinking about putting on more menus in the future. The other thing too, in terms of thinking about it as an agricultural product, is not just sort of the seed pods and the seeds themselves as a food source, but other ways that we might generate information that can help us improve the agriculture and farming of the plant. And that's not something that I don't know a great deal about from the perspective of agriculture and horticulture. But I know that there are ways through genetic analyses and others that we can begin to address questions about what genes were actually modified and adjusted by people. I mean, the cool thing about domestication, as I think of it, is it's not just about how people tame plants. It's a little bit more sordid than that. It's really people interfering in the sex lives of plants and animals. That's really what it's about. And if you think about it in that way, then it's like, well, what is they were keyed into? Obviously, the emphasis on the length of the claw for basketry fiber, but increasingly, as I eat more of it, I think, well, it's not just maybe can we get more 5-claw, like this one blew me away. I knew it wouldn't mature, but I saved it. But or the 3-claw, some of which August Wood has had success growing. There are opportunities to think about sort of increasing yields and learning about the plant in ways that might be beneficial to people that want to grow it for fiber or food. But when it comes to the food option, I'd say there's a lot of real untapped potential there with devil's claw. And of course, as a fiber source, this is a small basket start I made last summer. And I sort of think it was east meets west because I was visiting, whoa, what happened? I was visiting my in-laws in Western Pennsylvania. This clicker doesn't like me. Oh, weird. Okay. The lower right. I'm just gonna do that. Is eastern hemlock root, so a plant I collect from my in-laws' property, and silky dogwood used as the foundation rods, and then a little bit of the wild devil's claw that I collected up in Sabino Canyon on private land. I had permission when we had that really wet year a few years ago. So okay. So I've already sort of mentioned that we have some of these archaeological examples. There are, and I'll show you some photographs of some of the seed pods, but we have some of these fragments of baskets, but we also have a whole host of historic baskets. And one of the things that occurred to me is, it's sometimes difficult to identify the fibers just by looking at them. But again, having some familiarity with the technology, I thought, well, geez, I know that, when you're weaving, you've got to splice in all that new stitching thread. And if you're using the wild variety, you're having to do that a lot more often. In fact, I took some measurements, and if you look on the left, you really get maybe a couple centimeters of sewing when you're using these shorter wild devil's claw. But when you're using the longer claws from the domesticated variety, you can get lengths that span 4, 5, or even more centimeters in length. So you're spending less time processing and splicing in material when you're weaving. And this is something that we can actually track and measure in the baskets themselves. And so sort of as a test case, I went and took a couple of baskets that had a lot of devil's claw. I wanted to make sure I had enough to take multiple measurements and measure the distance, and found these two examples that you see here from the early 20th century, where one almost exclusively used wild devil's claw, and the other was almost exclusively using the semi-domesticated variety. And one of the things that I hope to do and think about more in the future is where we have information on the weavers, is maybe we can reconstruct information about how people are using the landscape or using local gardens in terms of wild versus domesticated plants. What does that tell us about the economics of the period when these baskets were being made and used? Can we track shifts or fluctuations over decades in the use of wild versus domesticated devil's claw that might give us another perspective and insight on how people were dealing with other changes in their communities? These are all sort of questions that are up in the air, but again, the potential seems really incredible for me when I think about all the baskets that are in museum collections, that we might be able to, with some simple measurements, alter this picture the way we think about the relationship between people and devil's claw in the last 150 years. Now, some of the archaeological materials are in pretty rough shape, whether they're stitches on the baskets themselves, or in some cases, one of the sites in the Point of Pine regions that you see here on the upper right, that's actually a box of wild devil's claw seed pods at the museum that when I stopped to take a look at it, I picked up one of the pods. I thought, these have had the claws cut off. These weren't broken off. So this is probably dates again somewhere between 900 and 1300. And it was found on the floor of a room at one of these sites in the Point of Pines region. We don't have any other information, but we can learn a lot more from this by things like radiocarbon dating and DNA analyses. And there's also, I'm continuing to learn, and I've heard anecdotes and snippets today from people about additional knowledge that is out there about devil's claw that hasn't been recorded or written down, that people haven't shared, that I find incredibly fascinating. You're telling me about chewing it and using it as like a skin ointment. I was telling you that I met with a delegation of citizens from Santa Clara Pueblo in New Mexico, and one gentleman and I were talking, and I said, you know, I was telling him about devil's claw and getting really geeking and nerding out, and he said, yeah, we had some at Santa Clara, and I heard you could eat it, so I got some and I ate it, and I said, and it was delicious, wasn't it? And he said, no, it was really bitter, and I thought, oh my gosh. One of the things that you see in plants that are domesticated is a reduction in their chemical and physical defenses. So people have fiddled with them to eliminate things that are prickly and pokey, and also that are poisonous or bitter. And so I'm hoping to get some examples of the plant that he was eating to see it's the same species, but it makes me wonder if the domesticated variety of devil's claw isn't tastier because people have actively worked and cultivated it to be tastier, to reduce some of those bitter compounds. So there's a lot of traditional knowledge out there that might simply be sort of worth sharing and amplifying. There also is an impressive array of both historic museum specimens and archaeological examples of seeds and seed pods, herbarium specimens that provide an archive of diversity in the plants. And I think this is particularly key when we want to think about understanding and sorting out the domestication of the plant, because it's insect pollinated. And so if you're growing a couple different varieties, maybe if I'm growing the wild variety and the domesticated variety and the three-clawed domesticated variety in plots just a few feet apart, they'll exchange genetic information owing to those promiscuous insects. And so what that means is that trying to untangle that history of domestication is going to be challenging, and we need a lot of different samples, a lot of different sources of information to sort of try and unpack it and untangle it. Because more than likely, what I suspect is this isn't something that was cultivated in just 300 years. Clearly, Native peoples have been working with the plant for millennia. But how far back in time, we just don't know. So one of the things that is of particular interest is thinking about how we might improve our understanding of sort of the timing of this and how that plays out. And radiocarbon dating is a technique that we use frequently in archaeology. It takes really small samples, is minimally destructive to generate estimates about the amount of time that has passed since that that organic tissue has died. And fortunately, in some cases, we've got ample samples that we could propose taking little bits without being too concerned about doing excessive damage. DNA is another possibility, as well as biomechanical studies. And I know the biomechanical studies sounds a little bit funny or silly, but you see this is a Proboscidea louisianica, a different species that I stepped on while looking for devil's claw in El Paso. This is not posed. I literally was looking for devil's claw where I was told I could find some, and I stepped on this. And you're seeing what is understood to be the mechanism of dispersal, how the seeds are spread. And it's cattle, horses will step on them. And if you handle the devil's claw, they're really, really tough and fibrous. And once the seeds, the claws start to dehiss, in botanical terms, or split, the seeds drop out. But once you step on something like that, the animal will walk on it until they can kick it off, or it'll break off. And they're continuing to sort of massage and work apart those really tough, strong fibers and disperse the seeds that way. And they will survive. I'm finding in conversations that August and I had today, perhaps multiple decades, these seeds will survive in the pods or in the ground before getting the exact perfect environmental conditions of moisture and temperature before they germinate. So we actually, there was a paper 10 years ago looking at the tissues of not Proboscidea parviflora, but I think of louisianica or one of the other species, a different species that looked at the tissues on the cellular and tissue level, and sort of remarking at how the tissues are layered and grow in a structural way that lends incredible flexibility with tremendous strength. And long story short, they sort of conclude this paper by saying, this is an incredible plant with remarkable biomaterial applications. And that's why when I said, if there are people that have entrepreneurial inclinations and want to think about biomaterial applications, devil's claw might be one of those. I've tracked down the botanist that did this work. He's at one of the universities in Germany. And I asked him, I said, did you do any work with the domesticated variety? He said, no, but we could easily do it. And I immediately was thinking about some of the accounts I've read that people use devil's claw for the starts of baskets because it's really strong and holds up and doesn't weather like a lot of other plants. But also that it being such a strong plant, the domesticated variety, some people have remarked that they find that the domesticated variety, the white seed variety, actually is even more flexible than the wild variety. I haven't myself processed enough to kind of weigh in as a one independent observer, but it certainly seems like that's a possibility, that there is another dimension to how devil's claw has been modified. And of course, the angle of exploring the DNA research is that we can get by with doing really, really small, minimally destructive samples. That's not so much a concern for crops that are being grown today or modern herbarium samples, but might be more of a problematic issue when it comes to archaeological examples. But I'd make the argument that in certain cases, it's probably worth it to entertain the possibility because we can date it, we can anchor that in time and a particular place. Thank you so much, Martha. Thank you. And so I have a picture here. This is Dr. Jasmine Ramos Madrigal. Jasmine is a geneticist. She's at the Globe Institute in Copenhagen, Denmark. She's actually from Mexico, but she did her graduate work there and is working at one of the top genetics labs in the country, in the planet. She specializes in plant genetics. In particular, she's done a lot of work on the maize or corn genome. And when she wants a side project, she dabbles in the domestication of dogs. But she has been working with some of her colleagues on a project looking at what some people refer to as lost crops. And it's kind of it's a misnomer because they're not necessarily lost crops, but they are crops that people haven't traditionally focused on. Crops like cotton, potatoes, maize, wheat, big sort of staple international global import, get a lot of genetic attention because they're economically super important. But other plants like amaranth or devil's claw don't get this attention. And so she's pointed out to me, not only do she and her team have an interest in following up on the DNA of devil's claw, but there is also possibility for funding for graduate students. So I mentioned this, if you know people that are interested in genetics or interested in agriculture, Um, there's a possibility that this might be a project that could be fully funded. They might have to live in Denmark for part of the time, but it would be something that we'd get to work with together with Jasmine on. And I heard Denmark isn't a bad place to live. So there's that. Again, what I'm doing is throwing this out as sort of thinking about opportunities and benefits. And this is an excerpt from the paper I mentioned of the biomechanical properties of Martinia fruits. Martinaceae is the larger family to which they belong. But we actually really don't know how they disperse. We know that people step on them. We know that animals step on them. But there's a lot of speculation. So far as I and Christoph Neinhuis, who's the third author on that paper who I've been talking to, there are no well-documented observations about the plant being dispersed, its seeds being dispersed. There's anecdotal accounts of horses and cattle, and people presume bison stepped on them. But the only documented account I've encountered of devil's claw dispersal is a guy wrote in the 1890s about seeing a bison wallowing in mud and coming up with devil's claw on its wool. So it wasn't even stepping on it. It was just happened to be there at the edge of the wet, muddy wallow. So there are questions that bear on bigger issues about how is this plant dispersed and what role does that play? The proposal has been that devil's claw actually probably was dispersed by extinct fauna, extinct bison, extinct mammoth, probably extinct camel, all these species that died out in the last 15, 20,000 years ago or so. But a lot of these questions remain. And again, I think there's opportunities here not just sort of improve understanding of timing and chronology and space where devil's claw is being utilized, but what else can we learn about the plant's relationships to animals on the landscape and how that might have changed in the last 20,000 years? And again, also, thinking in terms of tangible benefits, there are questions that farmers today and weavers might have that can be brought to bear through the study of these specimens in museums, looking at the DNA record, perhaps, identifying the particular gene that explains the change in color of the seed coat. There are, given how the plants can cross, what other changes in the plant are associated with that change in the seed, and can we reconstruct and estimate how much time has passed? There no doubt will be lots of surprises, but it might also be able to give us an opportunity to reconstruct trade relationships and contact and exchange by looking at the genetic similarity between populations of domesticated devil's claw here in southern Arizona as compared to Chemehuevi territory. Or as I was telling August earlier today, I met up with a friend of mine who were both working with the Tejon Indian tribe on a project analyzing some baskets from a cave site in their traditional lands, Tejon and Chumash bands in Southern California. And my friend was out there recently and said, hey, I saw some devil's claw when I was out there. I said, well, send me a picture. You know how I feel about devil's claw, send me the picture. So he said they had long claws. I said, okay. I mean, it's all sort of relative. We'll see how long they really are. And they were these massive long claws. And I said, those have to be a domesticated variety. Where exactly did you get these? He said, side of the road. I'm like, were they near an old village? He's like, yeah, they're near the old Tejon village. I'm like, there's no documentation that people at Tejon, which sort of is an amalgamation of Yokuts, Kitanamuk, and Chumash groups, there's no documentation of them using it, but should we be surprised? No. Panamint weavers, Chemehuevi weavers, their neighbors were using it. But when and how did it get to Tejon? I mean, and the fact that plant was growing there just a couple of years ago on the side of the road, like it had self-seeded itself or laid dormant for decades or years on end to survive. I mean, people haven't been living there for well over 115 years. Again, really incredible plant. And then, of course, this is not my plant. I'm not interested in making money. I'm interested in eating it. I'm interested in sitting in my backyard and weaving more baskets and enjoying it and learning about it. But there are opportunities and conversations and collaborations that might happen from more talks like this, where we can think about ways that help get information and resources to people that might help them, whether it's fanciful ideas about biomaterial development or increasing awareness of devil's claw as a traditional food, something that can contribute to food sovereignty, as well as traditional food and craft practices. And of course, my hope would be too that for people interested in some aspects of the research that I've been talking about and proposing, training and educational opportunities, things that could be folded into ways to train people, whether it be agriculture extension services through the University of Arizona or other things as bears on archaeology and history. I'm open and I'm willing to spend time thinking about how we can spin them in ways that are useful to people. And so that's why I'm sort of on this Devil's Claw soapbox tour, as I get to talk about and share my excitement for Devil's Claw, but also make connections. So what's next? I am not a social media person. I'm really I have an Instagram account. This is not it. This is a new one I made, but I use Instagram to follow basket weavers, bead workers, quilt workers, and textile weavers. That's pretty much all I do it for. But I know it's even now it continues to be a really popular way of sharing information and I think bringing people together. So I made stickers. I tried to get them done and shipped so I could hand them out for the first time here, but they shipped, but they have not arrived in my mailbox in Tucson. But when they arrive, I will mail some to Sunday to share with those that like them. But I thought it was kind of a campy but clever way to say, you can take a sticker, put it on your water bottle or your laptop, and someone sees it and be like, what is that crazy looking plant? And they might say to you, ask me about devil's claw. And they might ask you, and that gives you an opportunity to sort of talk about it and share what you know, and maybe turn them to share what they might know and want to learn about devil's claw. So my thinking is at this point, I'm at the stage where I'm probably going to be thinking about reaching out to communities and museums to get permission to start getting some samples that we might process to start getting initial results for radiocarbon dating and DNA and biomaterials as appropriate. But this is how I'm envisioning a way of helping people keep in touch and in contact. I'm open to new ideas and alternative ideas. Again, I'm not a social media person, but if you go to this Instagram account, there is a link in the bio that takes you to a Google Doc that I've set up that has my contact information and resources. So it's a space that you can watch and look for more information. I have put a few posts of my experience with devil's claw, and I will continue to post stuff now that I'm at the point where, well, hopefully in the next week I should have stickers I can hand out. But I'm still learning. I'm hoping. I met Joshua Yazzie today at Ihug Heritage Center, and he's doing amazing devil's claw artwork. I literally sent him a direct message, be like, dude, I just met you today. We were talking about devil's claw. You didn't tell me you had this amazing artwork about devil's claw. August Wood, incredible weaving. I'm not quite sure how to, I guess I can share posts. This shouldn't be, the end of my presentation shouldn't be me asking you all for advice on how to use Instagram. I just realized where this was going. Anyway, all this is to say, bear with me as I try and sort out Instagram. But that's sort of my plan. Thank you guys so much for having me and listening to me ramble on and share my excitement for devil's claw. Thank you. Yeah, I'm happy to address questions as might be possible.
All right. With that, and because of that, we wanted to open the floor for any questions that you all may have. Is there any questions? Well, I don't know if you need it.
Yeah.
No, if you technically need it.
All right, so first, just let you know I'm Pipalash, and we call that Wakton. And so when bananas were introduced, they said Wakton, it looks like a devil's claw. The green shape of a banana resembles that. So, but today, when you just say Wakton, most speakers would be likely to think of a banana as a devil's claw. But that's the original name for devil's claw. And as far as other uses of it, maybe it's not specific to the devil's claw, but just anecdote that my grandmother told me when she was young mother, had several children, she lost the use of one of her arms for some reason and didn't know what was going on, but eventually she said my grandfather used devil's claw on her. I assume it's something like acupuncture to poke the area that was affected and burn cotton on there as well, and she regained use of that. So I don't think that was probably specific inherent about devil's claw, probably just needed something sharp to poke it with, but that was another use that I had heard. But one of the questions that I had was, and I don't know that you know the answer because you kind of alluded to it, was the reason for the seeds turning color. And because recently we've been kind of doing some experimenting with recipe with amaranth too, and we were using some of the commercially available, and I noticed that, well, in the wild, they're small, they're black, but the commercial ones are larger and they're white. So is there something inherent in that domestication process that maybe turns the seed white?
It's a great question, and Kelly, thank you for sharing the bit about your grandma's benefiting from devil's claw. Yeah, it's an unknown. It's something I think that we might get some clarity on with some DNA studies of not modern specimens. It doesn't necessarily have to be archaeological, but sometimes you do see this when there are alterations or manipulations of genes in the plant that yield increases in fruit size or something to that effect. There are linked genes or alleles that sometimes mutate or are caught up in that change. So yeah, the answer is we don't have any clarity, but clearly, given that it's such a hallmark of the domesticated variety, it's telling us something. But that said, again, August very kind of let me wag his ear for a long time about devil's claw this afternoon, and he showed me some black seeds from devil's claw that appears to have been cultivated that has really long claws. And so we set aside some of those seeds, and I thought, well, this is maybe a good test case for the geneticist to say, okay, look, these pods have long claws but don't have the dominant, or at least a dominance of the white seed coat gene. I don't know. They're fun, fascinating questions for sure. And of course, we're not meant to know everything, but it's fun to ask. Other questions?
Somebody else is going to ask another one.
Yeah.
I'm sleepy, so we'll see if this comes out right. If I understood correct, you said very little academic research has been done regarding devil's claw?
There's been a fair bit. I mean, it really it goes back to like the early 80s. So Gary Nabhan, who's a very well-known prominent writer and ethnobiologist, did a lot of really pioneering work along with Paul Bretting and Amadou Rea. So there was this sort of big output of research between like 1980, 81, and like the 89 or so. And there hasn't been anything since then. I take that back. There was a gentleman who at Arizona State University did a larger genetic study of Martinaceae. So the entire plant family, interested in larger familial kin relationships among the different genera in the Americas. And the limited genetic work says that yes, there is genetically the gene pool of the white-seeded domesticated variety is distinct. It's a real thing. It's not just looking different. But that's it. So I'm hoping, we're moving towards some new questions.
Okay, so as far as genetic research, I'm curious, the more you dig into this and the more that it's studied, let's say they discover that it does contain something really powerful and outside entities want to exploit it. How are you going to see that it's protected, that it's not exploited for us living communities?
Yeah, no, that is a critical question in terms of data sovereignty for tribes and communities to be able to maintain ownership. The slippery thing with this plant is that it has fairly wide usage. And so sometimes simply the acquisition of information about the genome doesn't necessarily bear or translate into those concerns about people exploiting it without investing millions and millions of dollars. So there are conversations that would be related to what happens with and how is the data curated, that would be, critical to any sampling or discussion about genetics. But that's yeah, a great question.
Mine's related to eating. So I had heard that it was edible, but I had never spoken to any tribal members who had claimed to have eaten it as a food source, other than the seeds, of course. So I really don't have any information on the pods itself being used as a food. So my question would be, is there a prime time to pick it for that purpose? Or is there a point where maybe it's too fibrous or to develop?
Yeah, I don't have a lot of experience. It's I think what I found is the young. I mean, you could tell by touching it very clearly that when they got too fibrous. But I know also that some people have pickled them. People have talked and written about pickling them. I don't know if that. I haven't tried it, so I don't know if that process would lend to greater flexibility, so that you could harvest them later when they're woodier and tougher, and the pickling might soften them up. But and again, not because I didn't want to waste or use up fiber sources. I was waiting till the end of season to collect the ones that weren't going to develop. But they had to be pretty small. They had to be pretty tiny, and you could very easily tell when they started getting too fibrous.
I don't know if I heard you correctly either. Did you say that you believe that the semi-domestication, you think is just in the last 300 years? Is that more conjecture, or do you have more?
That's what Gary Nabhan and his colleagues suggested based on sort of historical circumstance. And really one of the big lines of evidence was the lack of any archaeological white-seeded devil's claw seeds. The earliest examples that I've found come from a Akchin site that may date to the 1700s or 1800s that they found 14 seeds in the course of their excavations. And I think there's a chance they could be 1700s. So that might be the earliest, but all of the archaeological examples that I've been able to locate and look at all appear to have black seeds. But you get black-seeded devil's claw with really long claws. So yeah, it's just a lot of unknowns. But I think longer than 300 is what I would lean towards.
Yeah, that's what I would say. That I just thought I should I have intelligent ancestors, and it would make sense to, we have massive gardens, and it would be very easy to grow a devil's claw on your food. And it just doesn't make sense that it would not be happening to me for 300 years.
Yeah, and not to imply that this was. I mean, if you think about the context in which they made that argument back in the 80s too, it almost sort of sees Native people domesticating devil's claw as a response to non-native settlers. Yeah, and it doesn't. Not only does the timeline just kind of is hard for me to add up in my head, but it seems a more likely, more parsimonious explanation that people have been interfering in it and manipulating its reproductive activities for centuries. I mean, clearly we know from the archaeology, at least the last 1,000 or 1,500 years, probably even more than that we just don't have evidence for. Yeah, people weren't dumb.
So I have a question. Do you think that the domesticated seeds from black to white could be a sign of the use of the water? Like if the water is too salty, or has a lot of sodium, a salt in it, that might affect the growth of the plant versus, river or stream, fresh water, and, and even recent years, you know, with well water, if that might have an effect on domestication and the changing coloring of the seeds.
Yeah, no, that's a good question, and it could very well play a role. You know, I haven't had enough experience growing it, and that's where, you know, further conversation with people that have been growing it for a number of years can weigh in on this. But my take is that certainly there is some environmental consequence. I learned, I sent, in my excitement, sent August a photo of the first sort of sprouts when I had planted the seeds that he gave me, and he was like, "Oh, that's great," and then it was like, "You planted them too close together," and of course he was right, because I very quickly thereafter learned that, like, they need a lot of space, they crowd each other out, and downstream it had a negative impact on their productivity. I mean, I got a lot of amazing seed pods, but I mean, that had an impact. And I even, looking at plants that August grew, the shape and feel of the claw is different than the one that I grew. Now, is that just because I overcrowded them? Or is it the soils in Tucson? You know, I'm not growing them in floodplain soils. It's kind of rough soil in my front yard. I already know I'm going to go take a pickaxe and break up some of the caliche and see if I get different results. So some of the things that I recall from reading some of the other experimental studies that they did in the 80s was that there were sort of environmental variables that would impact productivity, but that their interest was really on, you know, what is affecting the number of seeds, the size of the seeds, the length of the claws, the length of the seed pods. So not as much attention to environmental variables, but I mean, yeah, you're absolutely right that it's playing a role.
Have you thought about doing any nutritional studies of the seeds, the more wild versions and the domesticated?
Yes, but I haven't. It's just one of those things that I don't. It's terrible because I eat everything, but I don't know anything about nutrition. Like I haven't talked to a nutritionist. I've thought about, like, certainly there's a nutritionist at the University of Arizona or somewhere that I can pick their brain. But yeah, I mean, the study that was done in the early 80s, their conclusion was sort of that there's slightly more protein oil. So I think it's absolutely worth revisiting that question and finding out if there's more, or looking for variability among the different varieties. You know, there might be surprises, or maybe that's something that can be enhanced with farming in the future.
Any other questions?
Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you so much again. Let's give another round of applause to our presenters this evening. We really appreciate you coming out and presenting here, and you know, the spa has a huge impact here in the community, especially with the readers. So just again, thank you for being out here and for taking the time to be with us this evening, as well as for everybody out here and those who are viewing. We really do appreciate your time and attention this evening. And hope from the future, we'll keep an eye out on whatever our next Intro to Art will be. So again, thank you everybody, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Martha. That was great
We'll
fun.
start your own channel for you.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll get it together.
Yeah.
Oh, and there's